Okay, hello and welcome. My name is Sarah Gura, and I am a master's level licensed clinical professional counselor in Illinois, and I am a licensed mental health counselor here in Florida. My practice is the self-care path, and I specialize in treating first responders. This is my second video for the presentation that I am calling First Responder Psychological Support. It expands beyond the 2-hour class that I do when I'm hired to teach at a department or an academy or for a safety course of some kind. So I hope this information is useful to you. I'm going to go in a lot on trauma workers today and some of the foundational information, psychological information that might be helpful in understanding some of the symptoms if you can relate to what I'm going to be talking about. But first and foremost, as always, I encourage people to take a nice deep breath in. On the exhale, go ahead and just release any tension in your body. Hopefully you could root down and sort of pull your shoulders down and away from your ears as you, as I always say, wiggle your toes, feel your fingers, and notice if especially you're carrying tension in your face. And just release it so that you can get into student and learning mode. These little transitions do a lot for us because, especially in our current culture, we are going 100 miles per hour all the time. And we don't need that. So we don't need that in our lives. And if we can listen and learn, I think that's super important for our mental and our physical health, even our spiritual well-being. But without any further ado, as I say, let's get right into it. The first vocabulary concept today is potentially traumatic events. And this term really gained its popularity or became more well known in the first responder world shortly after 9/11. Again, we realized how much we were not taking care of first responders, and professionals got together. They wrote their white papers. They came up with the 16 life safety initiatives, which I totally support, and that's why I'm doing this. But in particular, the 13th life safety initiative, which is first responders and their family members must have access to counseling and psychological support services. And psychology education, as it's relevant to your career, is certainly one of those things, in my opinion. But during those studies and those understandings, we started to admit that first responders are always going to potentially be exposed to traumatic events. So I personally refer to all as trauma workers. And I have mentioned before that I'm a trauma worker. But by far, I have been more prepared to deal with the trauma exposures that I have than what first responders have had. And they're the ones experiencing all of this in the field. I experience a lot of what you see on the screen in the office listening to you. But the actual exposure to the incidents are frequent, especially if you're going to work in this career for 20 plus years. Um, so anyway, important to know that you are a trauma worker and that you are going to, as a trauma worker, be up against or confront or even work through potentially traumatic events that are not yours and that are yours. And I have another concept up at the top, spontaneous intrusive cognitions. And with all the love in my heart, I have always said that first responders have a sickness. And that sickness can be described by spontaneous intrusive cognitions. Now, how did I come up with this term? It was actually on a ride along in Chicago on Ambulance 10, well over 10 years ago, actually. And we had responded to a fairly significant traumatic call where there was an alleged sexual assault, and then two men engaged in a violent altercation. And we had a machete involved and several cut wounds that I was with the ambulance on to treat. And it was a unique situation. I remember the police saying, it's street justice. And as we went back into the hospital and we were doing the notes on the call and having to clean up the ambulance, the conversation with the paramedic involved this idea of telling me, Sarah, I just have these spontaneous intrusive cognitions. And I thought, well, what do you mean by that? And that's when we started this discussion of, well, when I see a white cross, I don't see a white cross. I see who died there. And when I drive through this intersection, I sometimes think of that car accident. Or when I drive by that apartment complex, I remember the bipolar that doesn't take his medication and some of the things that we've had to do repeatedly in that building. So if you are a first responder and you're exposed to all of these calls and you're living in that neighborhood, the potentially traumatic events could definitely give you a bunch of spontaneous intrusive cognitions, but also any situation, it doesn't just have to be in your neighborhood, I hope that's obvious, can activate old traumas and actually trigger you to regress and fall into the past. Now, first responders, for whatever reason, they have come to like hate the word trigger. Don't say triggered. Well, it's super helpful to know that word and to understand it. But what I do emphasize is that we can be activated, meaning in street terms, you triggered my trauma, but I'm able to contain that and act professionally and in a healthy way, behaviorally, before, during, and after that activation. But many people, they like to ignore, deny, minimize, and numb that they were in fact triggered. Their brain does regress back into the past, and they can pull up a bunch of potentially traumatic events, even back from their childhood. And that creates a lot of mental and behavioral and even physical, spiritual dysfunction. So let's get on to what I have here listed as well. When we have trauma workers, we are dealing in human illness, human suffering, human death, human stupidity, human stupidity, human stupidity. Let's give it three's the charm, and property destruction. And when you pair that with issues that are going on in your department or at the station with your particular crew, or any of the politics and bullshit that happen in the first responder world, you have a really heavy load. And that's a lot for the mind and body to be constantly processing. And like I said earlier, many first responders aren't given the coping skills. So there's a level of dissociation that they use in ignoring, denying, minimizing, and numbing out. But again, so important to understand trauma workers. But we don't prep you even when you are in the first week or in orientation, and you look at that beautiful job description, it doesn't say any of these things so much as explicitly. It'll say you're going to help, save, protect, rescue, be a public servant, and you're going to get sworn in. And it's going to feel very official. But behind that, underneath that, is sort of the boogeyman of human illness, suffering, death, stupidity, property destruction, and that this is trauma work. And you will be exposed to potentially traumatic events, and that can give you many spontaneous intrusive cognitions, which overload the mind body. And so learning about this and accepting it, you may not want to approve it, but you have to at least on some level accept that you are indeed a trauma worker. And that is the beginning of understanding, how do I take care of myself when I'm exposed to all of this? So what does it look like in the therapy office, this mental, physical, and spiritual health issue that trauma work can give to someone or cause? And I look at men's psychology. That's why it says that there, because the bulk of my experience is in working in male-dominated careers. So the bulk of my clients are men, but of course I treat female first responders as well. The women in the field experience all of this very similarly. And so when I talk about first responders, male or female, it counts, but also the bulk of my experience is in male-dominated careers. So what do I see coming in? Usually it's one or more of their relationships are failing, whether it's personal or professional, and that's what makes them want to start counseling. They may also claim that they have an anger issue, which for men, anger is the manifestation of depression a lot of the time. We have that nice and well researched and understood. They come in because they're feeling stress. They might have a particular work issue that made them say, now I really do need or want to talk to someone. We have substance abuse issues or other addictions, and even body image has brought people into the counseling office. And it's usually pretty critical. I think it's important to emphasize that by the time a first responder or a man has come into therapy, he has been in the culture of don't talk about it, don't cry about it, and don't ask for help, or something must be wrong with you. And when we do that to a person, they try to follow those rules. And women also try to follow those rules when they're in male-dominated careers. And what it really does is hurt them on a deep level, because that is not our natural way to dissociate or to clog up all that experience. And when I say clog up the experience, I think of how being stoic is used as a coping mechanism. I'll say it's not a coping skill. And the definition of stoic in my office is emotional constipation. And if you're constipated, eventually you're going to have to blow that out. And so these are the areas that most bring in, according to research and statistics, men into the counseling office. And of course, women who are in male-dominated careers, very similar. Now, I put the brain-gut connection image on here because we really have to discuss this and understand that we have two brains, one in our skull and one in our gut, called our intestines. There's an entire microbiome there, and it communicates bidirectionally in our bodies through the vagus nerve system. And actually, more information goes up to the brain than down. And there are many microbes that are in your gut that produce different signals to tell the brain what's going on. So when people are like, do I have ADHD? I have a bunch of brain fog. I'm not good at organizing. I have to look at the whole person. What's your gut health like? What's your mind like? What's your environment like? And so I'm putting this image in there that we have to address all of it. And I'll be more specific as these classes unfold, and even within this course right now. So again, let's keep it going to understand what we are doing and talking about here. I want to advance this slide. There we go. So in psychology, or in counseling psychology, we also talk about, well, what are our clients' presenting issues? And I wanted to stop and say, well, what are the initial assessments revealing about first responders? And we'll go right off, the list here and say, when people are not sleeping well, they're not eating well, they're not hydrating well, they don't have a regular exercise routine, and they're not feeling playful or joyful or even realistic in how they're experiencing their world, then, I definitely say, okay, that is a presenting issue. That's a reason to come on into counseling. And it's fairly common, so common that I'm putting it right here on the list as the top 4. And what I often tell people is you have to stop making your career your priority, or your reason, or who you are, or what you're going to contribute to society. I know it's a very big deal for everyone, and we get pressured when we're young by being asked those questions. What are you going to do with your life? Who are you going to be? How are you going to, do some generativity or give back to society? And then we go to schooling and we go through all this training and we pass all these exams and tests of not only our skill, but our character. And we get these jobs and careers that feel very much so like a vocation and a calling. And we have it wrong when that vocation is depleting the way you sleep, the way you eat, the way you hydrate, and the way that you choose joy. So this is a presenting issue. And I try again to remind people that your purpose on earth is not to go help, save, protect, and rescue everyone but yourself. That is not a life purpose. Your life purpose is to sleep well, eat well, hydrate, and choose joyful things, because that is exactly why I have a career myself, is because people can't seem to figure out how to do this consistently enough to sustain their own health and wellness. So the other thing, the other presenting issues that come in are relationship problems and conflicts. And if you remember, if you watched my first video starting this presentation, I talked about suicidology and how one of the things that can combat the completion of a suicide is actual love. Love someone who loves you back, and that mutual and reciprocal connection is very healthy, and it's happy, it's safe, it's free. But again, people are struggling with these basics, so I can't not list them out. And because they don't sleep well, eat well, hydrate, choose joy, or have healthy relationships, they're turning to substance abuse to help them do the dissociation. They're trying to take their pain away. One of the definitions of addiction that I like to use, and I will talk about addiction in another class, is that it is a good intention to try to relieve some kind of pain or try to fill where we feel empty. So I don't judge substance abuse issues or addiction issues. I understand that you are trying to ignore, deny, minimize, or numb something. Now, not everyone, falls into substance abuse or addictions, but it's certainly one of the reasons I have a career with first responders. And on top of all of that, the basic daily coping skills are very minimal. As I mentioned before, I have a lot of people that come into my office in these very high functioning trauma worker careers, and they are stoic. And they'll tell me that they're just blunt, they're just candid, they're just bottom line. But what they're really saying is, I don't have the language or the skill to deal with this. And so part of the therapy is teaching them how to do that. And I will talk more about that in a mindfulness class as well. So on top of all of these presenting issues, the final one that often makes someone come into the office that I actually assess, create a treatment plan for, and then do the therapy and aftercare about is the unresolved past trauma, whether it's from their personal or their professional life. So I hope this is validating and it's sort of enlightening, and it helps you understand, like, what are first responders coming into therapy for anyway? And this is it. That is the mental, behavioral, psychological issues that I think are most prevalent, at least prevalent enough to put in the list. So what does this do to your body? At the very beginning of the career, what I see happening to those who are in training for these careers, whether police, fire, dispatch, emergency department professionals, military, as we put so much stress and strain on your body. And adrenal fatigue is a lay term, and it's not accepted as a medical diagnosis, but it's all the things that you might experience at the beginning, fluctuations in your body's functioning and burning the candle at both ends, which eventually burns out. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. But we have to give credit to how much energy is dumped and how much of that is fueled by your own past traumas or your own negative cognitions or your own unwellness. And all of that has to be sort of used. That pain is used as fuel to get you through a very tough time. And we often don't talk about how taxing that is and what you would need to do to build a strong gut microbiome, to build a strong mind that can cope, problem solve, and do conflict resolution. So again, this mind-body connection is very real. And when your mind and body are not on the same page, the spiritual health depletes as well, because it doesn't feel like you're living a life worth living. So pretty significant here. Now, as you go through this career and you have that adrenal fatigue, you might continue to burn yourself out, which again, I will talk more and support this slide in just a moment. But when you burn that candle out at both ends, you can go into something called an HPA axis dysregulation, or HPA burnout, we call it for short in my office. And the H stands for hypothalamus, P is pituitary gland, and A is your adrenal gland. So while we were giving you a bunch of adrenaline dumps, we may have sort of burnt you out. And when we give you more trauma work and more exposure to human illness, death, suffering, stupidity, property destruction, politics, and bullshit, we diminish your cortisol production. And the body may no longer adequately respond to your stress. And so now we're straining you, and the body is going to know it. So this is where you are very vulnerable to inflammation. And we know that inflammation could lead to chronic inflammation. And chronic inflammation is what leads to all our disease. And if we look at that word, it's dis-ease. I am not having a good, easy life. It's dis-ease. And then we see those cancers, strokes, heart attacks, diabetes type 2, and different autoimmune issues. And certainly I have been doing this for 18 years. I have started with guys that were very healthy and they were bright. Their skin looked great. Their hair looked great. Their bodies were in shape. Their attitudes and their moods were a little cocky and stoic. But as they aged, I saw that cancer, stroke, diabetes, heart attack, autoimmune kick in, or the substance abuse, or the divorces, or the distance from their children, and the fear of retirement happen. So yeah, we have to talk about this in the first responder world. Not only am I working through these issues with thousands of first responders in my career time, but I'm witnessing it on a longitudinal sort of ethnography, right? Ethnography is when you're immersed in a culture that's not yours. So that's definitely happening. Now, you see in the lower left-hand corner, there's something called the high ACEs scores. ACEs stands for adverse childhood experiences. And when I do my initial assessment to see what brought you in, what are your presenting issues, how burnt out are you from life, the higher your adverse childhood experience score is, meaning the more you tell me that you experience things that you were upset by, to put it briefly and quickly, then the more you are vulnerable also to this inflammation, chronic inflammation and disease. So we've also researched that in the psychology world, and we definitely know that when we repeat trauma and we layer trauma and we get chronic PTSD or complex PTSD cases, then of course we're going to see a whole lot more of the disease and the inflammation and the consequences of that. So let's take a look at my next slide so that we can focus in on, well, what do you mean adverse childhood experiences? So many of my first responders don't want to acknowledge that your childhood has anything to do with the career you picked or how you're handling anything. But how you were and how you are nurtured by those in charge truly matters. And so I have a leadership course where I address this as well, because if you are in charge of someone, you are not just commanding, supervising, delegating, and participating with them. Our relationships and how we work together is super significant to how our bodies and how our minds and how our behaviors will function. So let's go through the different attachment styles. Of course, I want to start with secure first, and I put that in green because when you have a parent, a boss, a spouse, someone who's in charge of you in some situation, when that person offers secure attachment, this is connection and protection. back and forth, mutual and reciprocal, right? We're social and we are engaged. Now, parents, it's a little less mutual and reciprocal until we get older. But by and large, what we're supposed to be doing, not only as parents and as leaders and as spouses, lovers, is connection and protection. And the reason for that is how we do health. That is how we grow. When we're connected and protected, we will grow into our potential just fine. And if we have any obstacles, we're going to heal because we have these secure, connect and protect relationships. Again, why I put that as one of the main things that prevents those suicide ideations and completions. So what's the other attachment styles? What I haven't read here because it's no bueno is deprivation. And deprivation is when someone is abandoned or abused, or both abandoned and abused. This creates the most helpless and hopeless people in our society. These are the people that end up with severe addictions, homelessness, unable to keep a job. They might be that person that lives under the bridge, right? The abandonment and the abuse has left them helpless and hopeless, and you could see their whole being sort of decaying. And per the ACEs research, we know that they are the ones that end up with substance abuse, homelessness, disease, chronic inflammation, cancers, and even street violence. So this is pretty awful. What many and most of my first responder clients have experienced is not secure attachment, but not deprivation either. What they do experience and describe a lot is intermittent or partial. It's also called inconsistent attachment styles, not only in their childhood, but with their leaders and their spouses. So they're cycling. They're in this state called repetition compulsion, which I'll talk about in a moment. But intermittent attachment is on and off nurturing, and it causes pain and fear. And that pain and fear can escalate to anger, anxiety, and panic. And then it just cycles. So, an extreme example of intermittent parenting, just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, is let's say on a Friday night, a father takes his son to a baseball game. And on the drive there, they are having a blast. And they get to the game and they order their hot dogs and they have their drinks and they watch the game. And maybe they even win and they take their Facebook photo, and they post it up on Instagram or whatever. And then the very next day, that dad kicks his son's ass for not cleaning his room and tells him what a useless, pathetic kid he is. And he never listens. And now he's grounded because his room isn't clean. So that intermittent parenting sends one message and then the other. And that is going to make the child anxious and angry and panicky. It's going to make them pretty greedy and clingy as well, because they're going to want the good stuff, but they don't know when they're going to get it or if it could ever be stable. So secure attachment, because first responders argue with me all the time, is not about spoiling or babying your kid. I never said that. I said that secure attachment is about connection and protection so that we all can grow and heal when we get hurt, because this is a dangerous, chaotic, and unfair planet. And shit's going to happen, but we will do our best when we have secure attachments and when we have relationships that are connected and protected. But once again, we struggle with this in the first responder world, and it creates all kinds of problems. Now, one of the things that I just mentioned was that repetition compulsion. It keeps you in a cycle. So first responders will also say, I saw this back then, I see it now, and I'm going to expect it in the future. Well, when you are in an intermittent attachment style of mind, you're going to think like that. In fact, you might have become savvy enough to notice like the anxiety attachment or the avoider, the one who is always demanding or the one who's always withdrawing. You're in a cycle when you're engaging those patterns, and there's always more to it, which is why I say go to therapy and find out beyond what is my love language, what the hell you're doing with your life. So repetition compulsion is no good. It's having a problem that you just keep recreating in different scenarios and in different relationships. But here's the good news. We know how disease works. If you repeatedly do something and you continue to replicate it, you will cause your own disease. For an example, keep drinking that beer, keep eating that pizza, don't work out, sleep terribly, and on repeat, you will have disease. But health is created the same way. If you sleep well, eat well, hydrate, and choose joyful things repeatedly, and you keep replicating those secure attachments, you're going to have a wonderful wealth of health. So this speaks to humans' neuroplasticity. And I separated this very long word so that we can learn it. It's psychoneuroimmunology. So what the hell does that mean? It means that when we can repeat and replicate something, our brains have enough plasticity, or we can mend it, we can change it and heal it or grow something. That means, yeah, therapy works, like good health works. It may not work in 24 hours like we all want it to, but if you repeat it and you replicate it, we do have a neuroplasticity. We do have psychoneuroimmunology. You don't have to worry about, is therapy really going to work? Is counseling really going to work? Yeah, it is. But you do have to have some grit. You got to put some effort into it, and it does take a little bit of time. But the repetition and replication of healthy habits is going to be a part of how you function, just like disease is very much so the way many people function in the United States. We just have to learn how to turn the page, turn the corner, switch our habits, change our repetition and replication patterns. So I'm here to tell you that the mind and the body truly do want to heal, but sometimes it needs to remember how, and learning things like this can help you understand that. But I also need you to understand that the mind and the body go together. And I have been told throughout my career that those are two separate things, and you have to have, a doctor for one and a counselor for another, but we're responsible for both. A doctor has to sometimes speak psychology, and I sometimes have to speak about the physical manifestation of mental illness. And together we can create an understanding and a treatment plan and a way to live where you don't have to feel all this terrible shit. Because complex PTSD is difficult. Now, let's talk about what that is. However, as always, I will dive deeper into post-traumatic stress disorder in another course. But for right now, we want to understand that first responders, as trauma workers, definitely have complex PTSD cases. So it can be one complex event. And maybe an example of a one complex event is that you get dispatched out to your parents' home and they have a health crisis or an issue that requires you to respond as a professional. So that could be very complex. It's personal, it's professional, it entangles your relationships. And hopefully your department would, once they realize what's happening, get you off of that scene. Your desire to be on that scene might, further the complexity of that situation. So complex PTSD can be one complex event, but it is also and can be a repetition of traumatic experiences, from your childhood on, or from probation year on, or since you started that relationship going forward. So repetition and replication is what we're looking at. And when we have repeated traumatic experiences, we have a replication of a maladaptive memory going on. There's that process that happens. And this is a fancy way to talk about sickness. So if you can kind of rewind your mind to when I first started this presentation, I said, with all the love in my heart, first responders are sick because they have these spontaneous intrusive cognitions, and it puts a shade of gray across their life experience because, again, they don't see that white cross. They see who died. They don't see just that building. They know what happened in there, and etc. So the maladaptive memory is painful because we do not just remember a traumatic memory, by the way, we relive it. So that maladaptive memory process is there. And again, I will talk more deeply about PTSD in another class. But speaking of that neuroplasticity, the psychoneuroimmunology, you do have neurobiological networks in your brain. It's in your mind. We can see neurons kind of communicating and moving toward one another and bundling together in a network. And what I mean by that, I'll break it down really quick, but we all have neurons. I'll put my hand up here. This is a great example of what a neuron looks like. This would be the neuron itself. These would be the dendrites, or the little fingers on that neuron. And this would be the axon hillock where my wrist is. And this would be the myelinial sheath on the axon. My skin is the myelinial sheath. And the thicker the myelinial sheath on a neuron, the faster this information travels. And so when you have a bunch of neurons that communicate to each other about trauma, and they're fairly thick and fast in communicating, absolutely, yes, you are going to have neurobiological networks in your mind that might need to be a little separated through the process of counseling or EMDR, which is an amazing therapy that, again, I will talk about in more depth in another class. But for right now, what we need to understand is that, yeah, we want to have that neuroplasticity, the psychoneuroimmunology to get rid of your repetition compulsion. So the psychopathological complexity to your symptom manifestation is huge. And of course, I'm smiling because I love this information. I get so excited about psychology, but I hope you're also kind of feeling it in your body that, like, oh, there is an understanding of this. I can validate my experience. And if I can understand and validate it, then we can treatment plan and we can lift these symptoms and help you to feel better. Because a lot of first responders do truly feel broken and helpless. And when someone says that to me, I'm like, oh, let's get to work, because we can grow and heal through the post-traumatic growth process. And we don't talk about post-traumatic growth because that would mean that you had PTSD, and having PTSD might mean that you could do a workman's comp and get your pension. And nobody wants to talk about the money or the legal process of that. But more importantly, most first responders don't want to psych pension out. They want to heal and do their job with integrity and feel a sense of self. But what we keep doing is talking about resilience, which isn't bad. I'm not bad-mouthing resilience training. It has its place. It's just that I work in the trauma realm. I'm a trauma worker. So I talk about post-traumatic growth. Resilience is about bouncing back in a rudimentary way, in a simple way. And I, again, think it has its place. If you show up to work and your lieutenant is being a douchebag, then I hope you are resilient. I hope there's a mind over matter there. I hope you choose you and you don't embrace the suck and just, join this guy. I want you to be resilient. But what I work with and what I deal with in the first responder world for emergency department professionals and for leaders especially, we talk about post-traumatic growth, and we consider that high ACEs scores or complex PTSD in the job can definitely affect the physical health of a person, their gut microbiome, and ultimately their mental health. So we have to talk about all of it in psychology, and we certainly do. Just what the first responder world is willing to accept is it depends. I'll say that very nicely. So don't mind me on my motorcycle here, but I think it's a great picture to help describe some of these stressors also that come in to play, since we are mainly focusing on what brings a first responder in for therapy. It's all of those things for all of those reasons, plus a couple of more words that I want you to know. So this starts with vicarious trauma. And vicarious trauma is a distress reaction that is experienced because of your exposure to trauma. And then you change somehow forever. And in brief, I put this picture up there because if I see a motorcycle crash, I will probably start wearing a helmet, or I will sell my motorcycle. That's not my current bike, by the way, but regardless, I think I would change. In fact, even as I age, I'm changing. And I have EMDR'd so many motorcycle crashes. The way I ride and the safety that I have in mind sometimes makes it less pleasant to be a motorcyclist. But my hope is that you can see this image and remember that vicarious trauma is your own distress reaction, because when you're exposed to a trauma, you somehow change in your personal life because of it. Yeah, I was going to give another example of ATVs. I've known some first responders that jump out of airplanes, they ride ATVs, they go scuba diving. There's so many different things, high risk stimulation seeking hobbies that they have. And then when they go on a call or something happens to them personally, that trauma makes them change somehow forever. So feeling the effects of a trauma can change us. Now, what about another type of cumulative stressor that I want you to pay attention to? We have empath fatigue and compassion fatigue listed here. Again, these are the things that play into that adrenal fatigue to the HPA burnout, piles on top of the adverse childhood experiences, changes the way the mind and body communicate with one another through the gut microbiome, the vagus nerve, and of course, your mind. But I put the pictures of the calloused hands there because one time I was teaching this class and the firefighter said, well, Sarah, that's all I got. You know, a construction worker is going to swing his hammer for 20 plus years and he's going to get calluses on his hands. So doesn't it make sense that I would build like mental calluses? And I said, you know what, that's brilliant. You're making great sense there. I agree with you. But what is it actually called? What are the other things other than trauma and ACEs scores and body issues? You know, what are the other things that are happening that callous the mind and make us want to ignore, deny, minimize, and numb? And I'm mentioning vicarious traumas that change you forever do that. And so do these two different types of fatigue. So empathy is when you can put yourself in someone else's shoes, and it can be emotionally exhausting to experience the trauma of others, especially if you're having a black cloud moment, or if you've ever been named the angel of death. If people just stop wanting to be on shift with you, you could definitely be feeling empath fatigue. And it is so important that trauma workers do not work from a place of empathy, but a place of compassion. And we do have to learn how to create those boundaries. And again, I will talk about transference and countertransference and how to set boundaries with clinical data about a situation. But for right now, I want you to understand that I don't want you to put yourself in someone else's shoes. Empathy can create all kinds of codependence issues. Instead, we're going to use empathy to be mindful in how we do our compassion. Otherwise, empath fatigue, adrenal fatigue, and all the rest could make you not well or unwell, literally. So what about compassion fatigue? I'm telling you to be more compassionate in your approach to the world around you, in your exteroception, right? But why do that if you can get compassion fatigue? Well, let's talk about it. First, let's say, what is compassion fatigue? It's emotional exhaustion from the constant demands of helping and caring for others. So compassion is great until you have constant demands. until there are no boundaries, until you are the person who's going to go to work and help save, protect, and rescue. Then you're going to go home and be a parent and a spouse, and you're going to be an in-law, and you're going to be a neighbor, and then you get on another committee and volunteer, and then you're in charge of another special team. And so sometimes I find that first responders do not have a boundary with their compassion and with how much that they want to help. So part of healing is also knowing, what can I do without depleting and destroying myself? Okay. Otherwise, once again, we're going to get to that burnout, and sometimes as significant as the HPA burnout, which again is inflammation that causes chronic inflammation and then different types of disease. And again, in the first responder world, it looks awful in retirement. And we want your retirement to actually be your oasis and the thing you look forward to, because you deserve it so much. But what is burnout? Back to the point. Well, let's look at the image that I have here. I think about a probie for that first matchstick on the far left, right? There's energy and there's interest and there's potential and there's that beginning intelligence and that desire to prove yourself. It's really a fantastic way to start a career. But then something happens to you, excuse me, and you look like that middle matchstick. And again, somewhat normal. We can turn that into wisdom. We can turn that into information that we use to our advantage, because pain is actually a type of fuel for our productivity and for learning our potential. It has to be. Otherwise, we're just going to suffer and die on this planet. But that last matchstick is the problem. If you look like the matchstick on the far right, by the end of your career, we did something wrong, because we're supposed to increase your level of functioning, not deplete it. And burnout is the breakdown of your willingness and your ability to perform your job duties because of the overwhelming stress that has accumulated and layered itself. And many first responders don't like to admit this. When their willingness goes down, their ability to do their job goes down. And that goes the same for relationships and parenting and technical skills, all the way to the compassionate ones. So please pay attention. If you are in burnout, you have a breakdown of your willingness and ability to do the job, which is dangerous. And while we have OSHA standards and safety standards and all kinds of NFPAs in the fire service and SOPs and SOGs and SMOs to help you stay in a nice, safe and high functioning category, we can still break down internally and not be as well as we hope to be. So asking for help, again, is very important. But what do you guys do instead? Trauma bonding, not trauma healing. Trauma bonding, not post-traumatic growth. Trauma bonding is when you experience something traumatic and it becomes tied to the relationship you have with someone, something, or some time. Sometimes, like if you were in a fire together and you can look at each other and it's like you don't even have to say anything. We're already brothers, and I get it. We're trauma bonded. Sometimes it's something. I think about how many helmets, weapons, vehicles have such a connection to a first responder, or make them feel like it is so significant, like that object has personification, right? Like human quality to them with a bunch of emotion tied to it. It's a trauma bond. And sometimes it's for some time. Think about the anniversaries where you go to the graveyard and you take a shot for that person, or that time of year comes around and you remember that particular call or patient or whatever it was that you were responding to. And on its way up to that anniversary, during and after, you're sort of suspended in this anxious state, and you're trying to state change, but you haven't quite learned the coping skill of state changing, which is called allostasis, by the way. Brings you down from an activated state to homeostasis. Again, can't wait to keep talking about all these things. point here is that we don't want trauma bonding. It keeps you in the cycle and it layers the traumas and it doesn't help you sleep well, eat well, hydrate, or choose joyful things. So again, in the first responder world, we want to be very wise about all these things. So what's the alternative then, Sarah? If we're not going to trauma bond, well, a really good peer support team, which for years I have tried to talk about what I think is and would help make a good peer support team. And now there are more other professionals than I have ever experienced at the beginning of my career. Same for them. I'm sure when they first started, they felt very lone ranger at the time. But there are so many of us now trying to pioneer what will help you get through post-traumatic growth and that process of post-traumatic growth the best. And we're looking at a culture of peer support. Now, from the very beginning, when I wrote my first curriculum for peer support, I said we have to listen, validate, relate, and refer. And that is the job of a peer supporter. So I'm going to stick to that and we can build on it and talk about each, dynamic in the peer support class. For right now, the opposite of trauma bonding is being able to listen to someone and validate their experience. And if you can, of course, because you're a peer, you can spend some time relating. I mean, even saying to someone, man, after a call like that a few years ago, I didn't sleep well either. And my wife and I had a couple of issues, but I got back on track by doing these things or looking at it from another point of view. That relating can be so precious and valuable. And to be able to refer someone to a counselor that you trust or to a program or to some information or even to a leader in your, profession that has the ability to provide, the listen, validate, relate, refer is fantastic. And when you get to that referral, you are allowed to scope them out. I always say, like, therapists are so easy to fire, like, you just don't go again. And I know that process is exhausting, but we are including more and more first responder psychological support material for them to learn from. And getting that supportive help, I think, is changing many lives. At least I've seen that through thousands of first responders over 18 years. And I do want to emphasize that it is private and confidential, at least in the 2 states that I operate in. So I have a license in Illinois and one in Florida, and peer support is considered private and confidential information. And again, I'd love to cover that in another class. But for right now, I think I have totally talked about a ton of stuff that again is so exciting for me, but I hope that it absorbs, that it helps you process a little bit or consider the information for your own well-being. Why don't we just take another moment to relax, take a nice deep breath in. And on the exhale, go ahead and relax the body. Maybe taking a moment to thank yourself for doing a little bit of enrichment activity. I hope it was for you. It always is for me when I talk about this stuff. It's a great reminder, keeps it fresh. But do pull your shoulders down and away from your ears. Spread your fingers like starfish, or you can do party hands, jazz hands. Wiggle your toes, move your spine around just a tad. And thank you for being here. My name is Sarah Gura, and I'm a licensed clinical professional counselor in Illinois and a licensed mental health counselor here in Florida. My practice is the self-care path, and I specialize in treating first responders. Take good care. Bye-bye.